Dear curious listener, forget the smell of marker pens and warm photocopiers. Tonight, you'll take your place at a wooden desk, bolted to the floor, your knees knocking against the grain. At the front stands a teacher in a starched collar, watching you like you've personally offended the British Empire. But before you settle in, ask yourself, how did you get here? Not everyone in Victorian Britain had the right to sit in this room. Some paid dearly for the privilege. Others were turned away. And some never saw the inside of a classroom at all. This is the Victorian schoolroom, part education, part endurance test. So, no talking. Hands on the desk. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and tell me what country you're listening from. Most people just watch and disappear. Don't be one of them. It's nice to be seen every now and then. You're told you're going to school. The words sound simple enough, but here in the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, they mean nothing without context. School could be a sprawling stone building with tall windows and polished desks. Or it could be the damp front room of a widow's cottage where hens wander through the lesson. It could also be no school at all. Your first clue lies in where you live and who you were born to. The wealthiest children, not that you'd ever see them on the street, begin their education without leaving home. A governess arrives each morning, neat as a pin, to take them through their Latin verbs, French grammar, music scales, and perhaps a little history if there's time before luncheon. Boys will eventually be shipped off to one of those grand boarding schools you've heard about. Eton, Harrow, Rugby, where the buildings look more like castles than classrooms, and the punishments are every bit as stiff as the fees. Girls in those houses will stay home longer, learning the softer arts, watercolors, embroidery, perhaps the pianoforte. Just enough arithmetic to keep the household accounts balanced, and just enough reading to write polite letters. If you're lucky enough to be one of them, the idea of sitting on a hard bench in a drafty hall with 50 other children is as distant as Australia. For the comfortable but not aristocratic, the middle class, the path is different. If your father's a shopkeeper, a solicitor, or runs a tidy little business, you might attend a fee-paying day school or a grammar school. The days are long, the lessons serious, and you may even come home with a smudge of ink on your cuff to prove you've been working. Boys might get arithmetic, history, geography. The sort of subjects that make employers nod approvingly. Middle-class girls, of course, still find their education carefully pruned. A little sewing, a little music, a little French, and a reminder that their future is not in commerce, but in a drawing room. And then there's you, if your family owns nothing but the clothes you stand up in. Your school might be a single smoky room in the back of the church, where one overworked teacher tries to corral 50 restless bodies. If you're too poor for even that, it could be a dame school. The front parlor of an elderly woman's cottage where you learn your letters between the clatter of laundry kettles. Or perhaps a ragged school, a place where the poorest children gather, many of them barefoot, to share worn-out slates and whisper over crusts of bread. But let's be honest, there's every chance you're not in school at all. Your education might involve sweeping chimneys before dawn, hauling coal in the half-light, or selling matches in the market square. You can't write your name yet, but you know the price of a loaf and the exact look of a policeman who's about to move you on. The government says it wants more children in school. The 1870 Education Act claims all children between 5 and 10 should be there. 10 years later, they make it compulsory. In 1891, they even declare it free. On paper, it sounds marvelous. In reality, a classroom doesn't put bread on the table. A day in school means a day without wages. And for many families, that's not just inconvenient, it's impossible. So, if you're working class, your parents face a choice: send you to school or send you to work. And work is the surer bet when rent is due on Friday. You've heard the stories. A boy who climbed chimneys at 7 died of suffocation before 12. A girl who worked in the mill until her hair caught in the machinery. And somewhere in between those tales is you, standing on the edge of a decision you don't get to make. If you're lucky, you'll get a few years in the schoolroom, enough to scratch your name on a slate and add up the cost of coal, enough to read a letter from a brother who's gone to sea, or a father who's gone to war. This morning, you're one of the chosen. You stand outside the schoolhouse, clutching a slate you borrowed from your cousin. The air smells of wet wool and horse dung from the street. Children gather around you in a loose, uneasy line. Some wear boots polished within an inch of their life. Others are barefoot, their toes red from the cold. The teacher appears in the doorway, tall, unsmiling, eyes scanning the crowd like a general inspecting the troops. There is no good morning, no pat on the head, just a curt jerk of the chin that means inside. The room is long and narrow. Desks are bolted to the floor, their surfaces carved with years of initials. The light is thin. High windows make sure you can't look out and dream about the street. Boys on one side, girls on the other. Your seat is a hard plank with no back. You sit straight because there's no choice. Around you, the differences are clear. The boy 2 desks ahead pulls a leather-bound book from his satchel. The girl beside you has nothing but a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. You glance at the teacher, wondering if they notice. They do. They just don't care. Outside these walls, there are dozens of children your age who never made it in. The baker's apprentice down the lane, the 2 brothers who work in the stables, the girl you sometimes see selling violets by the station. They won't be here to learn the alphabet or to copy out Bible verses. They'll never sit in this exact seat, never see the chalk dust rising in the afternoon light, never learn how to hold a pen without blotting the page. And yet, some would say they're better off. School means rules, posture inspections, punishments for fidgeting, and the ever-present threat of the cane for those who step out of line. Still, for all its flaws, there's something about sitting here, slate in hand, knowing that, for the next few hours at least, you're counted among the educated. That, in the eyes of the law and the parish register, you are being improved. Whether that improvement will actually help you in the world outside these walls, well, that's another question. But for now, you're here. The teacher is about to call the register. The lesson will begin. And in this moment, with your knees knocking the desk and the smell of damp chalk in your nose, you belong to the small fraction of Victorian children who could. You've heard of them before you see one. The ragged schools. The name alone tells you what to expect. And yet you still feel that pinch of surprise when you step inside. No fees, no uniform, no awkward conversation about your father's occupation or whether your mother can read. If you have a body and a heartbeat, you can sit down. That's the rule. Which means the room is full of children who, in any other building in this city, would be turned away at the door. It started small. In the early 1800s, long before the Education Acts, working-class tradesmen and women, people with barely enough for themselves, opened their homes and workshops to teach the street children. They were carpenters, tailors, shopkeepers. No government salary, no polished brass plaque outside the door. just a belief that letters and numbers might do more good than another night spent begging. Later, the philanthropists arrived, the kind with clean gloves and a taste for righteous causes. They brought money, books, and the occasional stern lecture about moral improvement. Between the grit of the working class and the guilt of the wealthy, the ragged schools spread across the country like determined little mushrooms. The one you've found today is wedged between a pawnbroker's and a shop selling second-hand boots. Its front door leans slightly to the left, and you can hear the noise before you touch the handle, a restless hum of voices, coughs, and the shuffle of many feet on bare boards. Inside, the smell hits first. Damp wool, unwashed bodies, ink, and the faint tang of coal smoke drifting in from a stove that's doing its best, but failing against the draft. The room is cramped, the ceiling low, and the air already warm from the press of too many people in too little space. You squeeze onto a bench already holding 4 other children. The wood is polished smooth, not by craftsmanship, but by years of shifting bodies. The boy beside you has a crust of bread in his pocket. You can see it peeking out, and you try not to stare at it, or at the lice darting through his hair. The teacher is not what you'd call imposing. He's a wiry man with ink stains on his cuffs and a cough that could shake the rafters. His voice, however, could command an army. He barks out the first lesson, and the noise in the room drops by half. That's as quiet as it gets in here. The books, if you can call them that, are second-hand, pages foxed and covers missing. Some are held together with string. You share one between 3, taking turns to trace the words with your finger. Your reading is slow, halting, but no one laughs. The boy to your left can't read at all. The girl on your right reads as if she's racing someone only she can see. There's a rhythm to the place. A few minutes of scratching slate pencils, then a sudden interruption when someone tips over an inkwell or drops their bread crust. The teacher deals with these lapses briskly, a sharp word, a raised eyebrow, a hand on the shoulder. Discipline is firm, but not cruel. After all, these children are not here because they misbehaved their way out of a better school. They're here because this is the only school that will have them. Some are orphans, sleeping in doorways at night and here by day for the warmth as much as the letters. Others live with parents who work too many hours to notice whether they're in class or on the street. There's a boy who sells matches outside the station until midnight, then arrives here in the morning with eyes like bruises. There's a girl who works as a crossing sweeper, brushing horse muck out of the road in exchange for pennies, who sits here with her skirts still damp from the rain. And you are somewhere in between. You've had days without enough to eat, but you've also had days where you've gone to bed full. You own shoes, but they have holes in them. You can already write your name, but spelling Wednesday still feels like a cruel trick. The ragged school doesn't care. It's not about making you into a scholar of Greek or a future barrister. It's about giving you the basics, reading enough to find your way through a signpost or a Bible verse, writing enough to sign your name to a letter or a labor contract, counting enough to make sure your wages aren't short at the end of the week. And if the philanthropists have their way, enough moral instruction to keep you from ending up in the workhouse or the dock. Which is why your lessons are liberally sprinkled with warnings about drink, idleness, and bad company. At break, the room spills into the alley. There's no yard, no swings, no playground. Just a strip of cobbles where the children scatter, some playing tag, some just leaning against the wall to rest. You spot one boy turning a skipping rope made from knotted rags, Two girls jumping in time. Another sits cross-legged on the ground, eyes closed, face tilted to the weak winter sun. Inside, the teacher drinks from a chipped mug and coughs into his sleeve. When lessons resume, there's a hymn, tuneless, half-mumbled, and then back to slates and chalk. You copy letters over and over until your fingers ache. The chalk squeaks, the bench creaks, and every so often a cold draft snakes under the door and makes the nearest row shiver in unison. But as the afternoon wears on, you notice something odd. This place, for all its smells and shortages, hums with a kind of stubborn hope. The teacher doesn't have to be here. The volunteers who sweep the floor at the end of the day don't have to either. And yet they are. The same goes for every child on these benches. They could be out on the streets, earning or begging or sleeping, but they're here, learning. By the time the final lesson ends, your back is sore, your eyes are tired, and your stomach is reminding you that lunch was just a crust of bread. You file out into the street with the others, the sound of boots and bare feet mixing with the clang of a passing tram. The day's lessons aren't likely to change the world. You can't yet read the newspaper. You can't yet keep accounts. But you can read more than you could yesterday, and tomorrow, maybe, you'll read more still. That's the quiet miracle of the ragged school. It doesn't promise you a seat in Parliament or a fortune in the city, but it gives you a foothold, however small, in a world that otherwise wouldn't care if you could read at all. You glance back once before turning the corner. The door leans the same way it did this morning. The building still looks like it might collapse in a stiff wind. But inside, there are children bent over their slates, a teacher coughing over the alphabet, and the faintest hum of voices trying to turn letters into words. It isn't much, but for many, it's the only door that will ever open. And before you wriggle away from this scene, don't just vanish like half the children who never came back the next day. Subscribe, so you're at least counted among the ones who stayed. You leave the ragged school with the sound of chalk still scratching in your ears. The street is noisy. Cartwheels, boot heels, someone shouting about fresh eels. But in your mind, you're still counting the letters you learned. Before you can get too far, you pass another school. This one doesn't look like a school at all. No sign, no yard, no rows of windows. Just a small front door with peeling paint and a faint smell of boiled cabbage. Welcome to the Dame School. If you're imagining a trained teacher in a smart dress with a timetable pinned to the wall, think again. Dame schools are run by women, often widows, in their own front rooms. They are part school, part babysitting service, and part somewhere to keep the children while their parents are working. The room is cramped, the ceiling low, and the furniture looks like it's been here since the last century. A table in the middle serves as the desk for whoever can elbow their way to it. The rest of you sit on stools, mismatched chairs, or straight on the floor. The lessons are loose. You might learn the alphabet. You might learn to thread a needle. You might just be told to sit quietly while the dame stirs a pot over the fire. If she's in a good mood, she'll read you a Bible story. If she's in a bad one, she'll send you out to fetch coal. You can't help noticing that she smells faintly of gin, though you don't know enough yet to put a name to it. For parents, dame schools are cheap, a penny a week if you're lucky, and they have the added benefit of keeping children off the street. But no one's under any illusion. This isn't an education that will get you into law school. At best, it'll keep you out of trouble until you're old enough to work. Still, there's a warmth to the place, The fire is on, the dame knows everyone's name, and if you skin your knee on the way in, she'll have a rag to wrap it in. For the youngest children, it's a start. A few streets away, there's another kind of school entirely, the church school. These are easy to spot. A little stone building with a cross on top and a sign telling you it's for the instruction of the young in Christian principles, which is to say, you'll be learning your letters and your moral lessons in the same breath. You step inside, and the air smells faintly of polish and hymn books. The walls are hung with texts from Scripture, each painted in elegant hand lettering. You're seated on long benches in tidy rows. No slouching here. The vicar himself might pop in to inspect. The teacher begins with a prayer. Then comes reading from the Bible, then arithmetic, which is acceptable so long as you remember that God is the author of numbers as well as words. If your parents can afford it, you pay a small weekly fee. If not, the church might cover it, but expect a fair amount of gratitude in return. After all, these schools aren't just teaching the 3 R's, they're shaping moral citizens. You may leave able to read, but you'll also leave knowing exactly how sinful idleness is and why the Sabbath must be kept holy. And then there's the marvel, or madness, of Lancaster's monitorial system. The first thing you notice is the size of the hall. It's enormous, big enough to echo when someone coughs. And it has to be because there are more than 300 children here. 300. All under the watch of a single adult teacher. How? You ask yourself, as you're herded to a place in the far corner. The answer is the monitors. Older pupils chosen to help teach the younger ones. Here's how it works. The teacher gives a lesson to the monitors. The monitors then pass it on to their assigned group of children. The groups are scattered across the hall, each with a scrap of blackboard or a shared book. It's efficient, in theory. The teacher can control a vast crowd without losing their voice. And the older children get practice explaining things, which, depending on their temperament, is either very helpful or very unfortunate. You find yourself in a group led by a boy who's barely older than you. His hair is sticking up at the back. His handwriting is worse than yours, and he smells faintly of onions. But he's in charge here, and he knows it. "Hold your slate like this," he says, as if demonstrating some ancient art. You copy the letters he scrawls, trying not to smudge the chalk. Around you, the room hums with the sound of dozens of mini-lessons happening at once. Somewhere across the hall, a group bursts into giggles and is instantly silenced by a glare from the main teacher. It's not perfect. If your monitor is good, you learn something. If they're lazy, you might spend the whole day practicing the same letter. But in places where there's no money for more than one teacher, it works well enough to keep 300 children from complete chaos. You notice the discipline here is sharper than in the dame school and more practical than in the church school. Monitors are quick to report troublemakers, and the teacher, that one solitary adult at the front, can stop a room of 300 with nothing more than a raised hand. It's part miracle, part military drill. The biggest drawback? Noise. Even when everyone is technically working, the sound of 300 voices whispering, reciting, and coughing in the same space is enough to rattle your bones. By the end of the day, you'll be half deaf and smelling faintly of chalk dust. As you leave, you think about the strange spectrum you've just seen. The cozy chaos of the dame school, the polished piety of the church school, the organized bedlam of the monitor system. 3 wildly different ways to educate children. And yet, Depending on where you were born and who's paying, any one of them could be your whole world. For some, these schools are stepping stones. For others, they're holding pens until work begins. And for a rare few, they're the beginning of something bigger. Either way, you've had your first taste of Victorian schooling in all its forms, and tomorrow you'll find out what actually happens once the lessons start. You push open the door. It's heavier than you expect, and it groans in protest, as if it would rather stay shut and keep the cold in than let you drag more in with you. The first thing you see is the light, or more accurately, the lack of it. The high windows along the wall are tall and narrow, their glass a little clouded, as if someone smeared candle grease on the panes years ago, and no one's bothered since. They let in a pale wash of daylight that never quite reaches the corners. The rest of the room depends on gas lamps fixed to the walls, or, if you're really unlucky, candles set in iron brackets. Their glow is feeble, yellow, and a little smoky. The sort of light that makes you squint until your forehead aches. Forget bright whiteboards and ceiling LEDs. Here, shadows win. The desks are the next thing you notice. Not individual little tables, but long, heavy planks bolted to the floor, as if someone feared the children might get ideas about rearranging the room. They're scarred and ink-stained, the wood darkened by years of elbows, quills, and small rebellions carved into the surface. You shuffle to a spot and realize there's no easy way to get in or out without climbing over someone else, which is perhaps the point. Once you're wedged in, you stay there until told otherwise. Boys sit on one side of the room, girls on the other. It's not a matter of preference, it's an iron rule. There will be no mingling, no shared whispers, no accidental swapping of slates. Even the walking paths between rows seem designed to keep the two halves of the class in separate worlds. You glance over at the girls' side, neat braids, pinafores, hands folded in laps. Then at the boys' side, a little more fidgeting, a little more scuffed footwear, a little more staring out the high windows. Everyone pretends not to notice the other half, which of course means everyone notices constantly. At the front, there's one large blackboard, black in theory, more a dull gray from years of chalk dust that refuses to wash away. A box of chalk rests nearby, its contents worn down to nubs from constant use. In the corner, a wooden globe sits proudly on a stand. Even if half the countries are colored for empires that no longer exist or will vanish within your lifetime. Next to it, an abacus leans against the wall, the beads dulled with age and handling. There might be a map, probably of the British Empire, sprawling in pink across the paper like a boast, and perhaps a chart of the alphabet or a list of rules for proper conduct. None of it is designed to entertain you. It's there to remind you of the world's order, both geographical and social. The floor is bare boards, creaking under every step. A faint smell of chalk, damp wool, and coal lingers in the air, with an occasional sharp note of ink. Somewhere near the teacher's desk, a sturdy, elevated table that puts them physically above you. There's likely a cane. Not necessarily for frequent use, but its presence says everything it needs to. You sit. The bench is hard, the desk too high for comfort, and within 5 minutes, your spine already aches. You rest your slate and chalk in front of you, hands neatly folded as instructed. You don't speak. The rules are simple. Sit straight, face forward. Answer when spoken to. Don't fidget, whisper, or attempt to swap your broken chalk for someone else's longer piece. You look up and notice the teacher. Starched collar, hair neatly combed, expression somewhere between weary and watchful. They don't have to raise their voice. Just one steady look is enough to still the small movements in the room. A cough breaks the silence, then another. Someone's pencil rolls to the floor and wobbles away under the benches. The teacher ignores it. You're aware of every sound now. The scratch of slate pencils, the shift of boots against the floorboards, the faint hiss of the gas lamp. The high windows let in a patch of light that moves slowly across the blackboard, the dust motes drifting lazily in the beam. There's a strange comfort in the order of it all. The desks don't move, the rules don't change, and everyone knows exactly where they stand, or rather, where they sit. Still, the separation of boys and girls gnaws at the edges of your attention, not because you're desperate to talk to the other side, but because it makes the room feel like two halves of a story that never quite meet. The girls copy their letters in careful loops. The boys work on arithmetic, counting beads on the abacus or scribbling sums on their slates. Different lessons, different expectations, all under the same dim light. The room feels timeless, but also suspended, like a breath being held. You know the rest of the day will stretch out in neat blocks of reading, writing, arithmetic, and recitation. You also know that each hour will be punctuated by the same small rituals: standing to answer questions, marching to the front for inspection, turning to face the blackboard when told. It's not about comfort, it's about discipline. The layout is designed to keep eyes forward, spines straight, and minds, mostly, on the work. Whether or not you leave this place a scholar, you will leave it trained to obey. You glance again at the globe in the corner. Somewhere in its faded lines is your town, small, unremarkable, yet part of something vast enough to paint half the map pink. It's a reminder that you are a tiny dot in a much larger system, and that the desk you sit at, however cramped, is a privilege not everyone gets. The teacher clears their throat. All eyes snap forward. A lesson is about to begin, and whether you're ready or not, whether your hands are warm enough to grip the chalk or your stomach still growls from breakfast, the day in the Victorian classroom is officially underway. Most people just peer into this room and leave without a word. Don't be most people. Subscribe, so I know you were here, even if you sat at the back. The teacher's voice cuts through the stillness. Slates out. You reach into the groove along the desk and pull yours forward, a thin rectangle of dark stone framed in wood, faint scratches from previous lessons still etched across its surface like ghosts of failed sums. The chalk feels small between your fingers, already worn down from use. But before we get to slates, let's start with where you really begin, the sand tray. If you're young, very young, you'll first be given a shallow wooden tray filled with a thin layer of sand. No ink, no paper, no chalk to waste. You dip your finger and trace the letters you've just seen on the board. The grains shift, scratch softly, and for a brief moment you can see the shape of an A or a B before you ruin it with the next letter. Make a mistake? No problem. Just shake the tray. The evidence vanishes, leaving a fresh, blank surface, like the world's cheapest delete button. It's gentle, forgiving, and virtually impossible to get wrong unless you somehow manage to spill the sand entirely, in which case you'll be picking grains out of your cuffs for the rest of the day. There's a certain charm to it. You can't blot the sand, you can't smudge it too badly, and the worst you'll take home is dusty fingertips. But it's only the first step. Soon enough, you graduate to slates and chalk, the mainstay of Victorian classrooms. The beauty of the slate is its reusability. Write, scrape, wipe, repeat. You can practice your sums all morning without burning through expensive paper. Of course, wiping is rarely as simple as it sounds. There's no neat little sponge in a plastic tray here. More often, you lick your sleeve and rub at the surface until the chalk smear fades, or you spit directly on the slate and use your palm, which works, but leaves a faint smell you'll notice for the rest of the lesson. Slates are noisy too. Dozens of small chalk points scratching all at once make a sound like mice chewing their way out of the walls. Every so often, someone presses too hard, and the chalk breaks with a sharp snap, earning them a glare from the teacher. And woe betide you if you drop your slate. It might survive one fall, maybe two, but eventually the stone will crack, and you'll be stuck borrowing one from the pile of spares at the back, the ones with chips in the corner and a permanent smear that never quite comes off. Finally, if you prove yourself neat, careful, and unlikely to plunge the nib into your own hand, you earn the right to use a dip pen and inkwell. This is the final stage, the graduation to real writing. The pen is a slender wooden handle fitted with a metal nib, which you dip into a small pot of ink set into the groove at the top of your desk. The ink is thick, dark, and eager to stain anything it touches. Writing with it is a balancing act. Too little ink, and your letters fade halfway through. Too much, and you leave a blot. A sin so grave it can earn you punishment. A single careless drip can spread across the page like a spreading bruise, ruining your work and your mood in one slow blot. There's a rhythm to it. Dip, tap, write, breathe. You learn to keep your hand steady, your sleeve clear of the wet ink, and your temper under control when the nib catches on the paper. The teacher might walk by, glancing over your shoulder, their eyes flicking to any suspiciously dark spots on the page. And the smell, a mix of iron gall ink and old wood, clings to your fingers for the rest of the day. Even after washing, you'll find a faint bluish stain along your thumb and forefinger, like a badge of honor or a mark of shame, depending on how the lesson went. Each tool has its own place in the hierarchy of learning. The sand tray, forgiving, temporary, impossible to keep. The slate, practical, reusable, and slightly humiliating when you have to spit on it. The dip pen, elegant, expensive, and utterly merciless to the clumsy, and there's no rushing the process. You don't leap from sand to pen overnight. Every stage is a test of neatness, patience, and whether you can follow the rules without grinding chalk into your neighbor's hair. As you sit there, chalk dust settling in the creases of your knuckles, you realize these tools are more than just equipment. They shape the way you work, the way you think, the way you see mistakes. On a sand tray, an error is nothing, gone with a shake. On a slate, it lingers a little longer. On paper, in ink, it's there forever, staring back at you in dark, unblinking blotches. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that's exactly how the Victorian classroom wants it to be. Not just learning letters and numbers, but learning that the higher you climb, the less room there is for error. The teacher taps the desk at the front. Slates down. Dip pens back in their holders. The lesson moves on. You brush the chalk from your sleeve, smearing it into the wool, and glance at the sand trays stacked neatly in the corner, ready for the next crop of beginners who will trace their shaky letters and shake them away. It's a small, dusty cycle. But in the Victorian schoolroom, it's the cycle everyone starts in. The official answer is the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's what every Victorian education, no matter how grand or grim, claims to provide. It sounds simple enough. 3 neat words, each with the satisfying ring of self-improvement. But once you begin, you realize they're less about understanding and more about remembering. Reading doesn't mean wandering off into novels about adventure or romance, unless you count heavily moralized stories about children who learn the value of obedience just before they die of something poetic. Instead, you'll recite lines from the Bible, moral maxims, and approved history texts. You'll sound them out slowly, then faster, until you can repeat them without thinking or understanding necessarily. Writing is the same. You copy neat copperplate letters from the blackboard over and over again until your fingers cramp. If your handwriting leans too far left, you'll be told to start again. If you blot the page, you'll be reminded, sometimes with words, sometimes with a sharp tap, that carelessness leads to moral decay. Arithmetic is less about problem solving and more about drilling multiplication tables until they echo in your sleep. 6 times 8, 48. 7 times 7, 49. You say the numbers like a charm, hoping they'll protect you from the embarrassment of getting one wrong. But here's where the curriculum splits, the gender divide. If you're a boy, your slate will fill with mathematics, technical drawing, and geography. The idea is simple. One day you might run a business, work in engineering, or be shipped off to the far reaches of the empire. You'll need to measure things, draw plans, and know where Calcutta is on the map. Technical drawing means careful lines, angles, and measurements so precise you begin to resent rulers. Geography means maps colored pink for British territories, with lessons on trade routes, exports, and why the empire is such a marvelous idea. There's little mention of the people living in those pink-shaded regions, except to note what they grow, mine, or make for export. If you're a girl, the lessons shift. Yes, you'll still get your reading, writing, and arithmetic, but always alongside sewing, knitting, and household management. Because while a boy might be preparing to build a railway, you are expected to run the station master's home. Household management is a polite way of saying how to keep a house running without scandal or bankruptcy. You'll learn how to plan meals, budget for laundry soap, and remove stains from white linen without wasting water. There might even be lessons on how to arrange flowers for the dining table, because in Victorian Britain, even vases have rules. Sewing and knitting aren't just crafts, they're survival skills. A woman who can turn worn-out sheets into new pillowcases or knit socks sturdy enough to last a winter saves the household money and earns quiet praise for her thrift. Your stitches will be inspected. Your hems will be measured. A crooked seam is not just a sewing mistake. It's a comment on your character. Of course, the divide isn't absolute. Poor boys might find themselves learning practical skills too, carpentry, basic metalwork, especially if their schooling is run by a charity or trade organization. And poor girls, if lucky enough to attend at all, might learn just enough reading and writing to handle household accounts or sign their name before being sent into service. Still, the message is clear. The classroom is not just about learning facts. It's about preparing you for the role you are expected to play. You sit there, chalk in hand, and watch as the lesson unfolds. On the boys' side, heads bend over maps of Africa, rulers and compasses scratching across the page. On the girls' side, the soft click of knitting needles keeps time with the recitation of multiplication tables. You steal a glance across the divide. A boy frowns over a triangle that won't line up properly. A girl holds her sampler to the light, checking the neatness of her stitches. Different work, different futures, same cold classroom. There's a certain irony to it all. The 3 Rs might be the same on paper, but by the time you leave, what you do with them will depend almost entirely on whether you sit on the left or right side of the room. If you're a boy, literacy might mean reading contracts. If you're a girl, it might mean writing out the household budget. Arithmetic might be for measuring land, or for making sure the laundry maid isn't overcharging you for starch. The bell rings for the next lesson. You close your slate or cap your inkwell and prepare to move on. The boys stand to cue for the blackboard. The girls clear their desks to make room for embroidery hoops. And as you follow the rest of your side out into the corridor, you can't help wondering, not for the first time, how different the world might be if the desks weren't divided down the middle. A day in the life of a student. The day begins before the bell. You wake to the smell of coal smoke from the kitchen fire, and the faint dread that comes with knowing you'll soon be standing in the schoolyard, trying not to shiver too obviously. You arrive, boots dusty, hair neatly combed if your mother had the time, roughly flattened if she didn't, and take your place in the small crowd outside the doors. The bell rings sharp and thin, slicing through the morning air. You file in with the others, hats off, voices down. Prayers first. Always prayers. You stand in a long row, your breath puffing in the cold, while the head teacher leads a reading from the Bible. It might be the story of Daniel in the lion's den, or the parable of the talents, or something about obedience. Usually something about obedience. You mutter "Amen" along with the rest, careful not to stand out. Then the real work begins. Morning lessons run from 9 to 12. The blackboard looms at the front of the room, already covered with neat rows of words or numbers. The air smells faintly of chalk dust and boiled wool from damp coats hung on pegs. First up, reading. The teacher points to a line from the set text, probably the Bible or a moral tale, and calls on you. Your voice sounds too loud in your own ears, and you try to make it steady as you read the words in the exact tone expected. Any stumble earns a correction, sharp and public. Next, writing. The desk feels harder with each passing minute as you copy letters or sentences over and over. Neatness is a virtue, the teacher says. You begin to suspect neatness is the only virtue anyone here cares about. By the 4th hour of copying your spelling words, your hand cramps. You flex your fingers, carefully, so the teacher doesn't think you're signaling a rebellion. Finally, arithmetic. Numbers march across the board in long, unwavering lines. You whisper the sums to yourself, tapping the slate with your chalk in rhythm with the rest of the class. 6 times 6 is 36. 7 times 8 is 56. You could almost do it in your sleep, and sometimes wish you could. At 12 o'clock, the bell rings for lunch. You don't eat here, not unless you've brought something to nibble in your pocket. Most children head home. The walk back is quick if you live nearby, longer if your family has had to move further out to find cheaper rent. Lunch might be bread and dripping, a bowl of broth, or, if it's a good day, cold meat from last night's dinner. Then, before you have time to linger, it's back to school. Afternoon lessons run from 2 to 5. The first hour might be geography, maps unrolled with a faint smell of varnish, a wooden pointer tapping out the names of rivers and colonies. Or history, a list of monarchs and battles you'll be expected to recite in perfect order. For the girls, sewing, knitting, or household instruction. Needles click softly while the teacher's voice floats above, explaining how to hem a skirt or make do when the sugar ration runs low. For the boys, technical drawing, carpentry basics, or more advanced arithmetic. Rulers scrape, compasses squeak, pencils wear to a fine point. Somewhere in between, there's drill, not the kind with marching bands, but physical exercises to straighten posture and improve health. You raise your arms, twist at the waist, and try not to yawn. The last part of the day is for review. You might be tested on the morning's spelling words or the afternoon's lesson. Sometimes the teacher chooses the same unlucky child 3 times in a row. Sometimes they catch you daydreaming and call your name sharply enough to pull you back to the present. And always, there's the unspoken rule: do not be late. If you arrive after the bell, you're marked down and often punished. A rap across the knuckles, being made to stand in the corner, or the humiliation of reciting your tardiness aloud. Absence without reason is worse. Poor families who keep children home to work risk fines or visits from the attendance officer. When 5 o'clock finally comes, the bell sounds less like a command and more like a release. You put away your slate or pen, stack the books, and stand until the teacher dismisses you. Only then can you step outside, the light already starting to fade in winter months. You walk home with the day's lessons rattling in your head, scraps of scripture, multiplication tables, the faint itch of chalk dust in your sleeve. Tomorrow it will all begin again. There's a sameness to these days. The timetable rarely changes, and even the punishments are predictable. But in that sameness lies the purpose: to train you into a rhythm you will carry for the rest of your life. Work, pause, work again. Sit still, speak when spoken to, and keep your head down unless invited to raise it. Victorian school isn't just about teaching you facts. It's about teaching you to fit. You shift your weight and the desk creaks. The teacher's eyes snap to you. Your stomach drops. You've done nothing wrong. Yet. That's the thing about a Victorian classroom. Wrong is a moving target. The rules are not just rules. They're a framework for how to exist. Speak only when spoken to. Sit straight, feet flat on the floor, hands on the desk. Keep your work tidy. No smudges, no stray marks, no excuses. Posture is inspected the way a sergeant inspects soldiers. Shoulders back, chin level. If you slouch, you'll be corrected on the spot. If you fidget, you'll be reminded that stillness is the mark of a disciplined mind. And silence. Silence is gold. Punishments are not gentle nudges back to good behavior. The cane is the most famous, and for good reason. A thin rod of rattan, light enough to whistle through the air, heavy enough to leave a welt. Strikes across the palm for minor offenses, across the backside for more serious ones. The sting is immediate, the ache lingers, and the humiliation is worse than the pain. The dunce cap is another favorite, a tall, pointed hat with dunce, written in large letters, placed on the head of the offending pupil, and worn while standing in the corner for all to see. It's less about reforming the offender and more about turning them into a warning for everyone else. Then there are lines, hundreds of them, written out until your wrist protests. I must not talk in class. I will keep my work neat. I must be punctual. Over and over until the words lose meaning and become pure muscle memory. Standing in the corner is a quieter punishment, but no less effective. It turns you into part of the scenery, still and silent, while life goes on without you. A living reminder that the teacher's patience has limits. Of course, punishment is not just for obvious crimes. There's the subtle kind, the long stare that freezes you in place, the raised eyebrow that tells you you've been noticed and should correct yourself before it goes further, a pause in the lesson, so the whole class feels the weight of one person's mistake. And there are collective punishments too. One child misbehaves, the entire class pays for it. Fewer privileges, extra homework, a longer drill session. It's an efficient way of ensuring everyone polices each other. The fear is constant, and that's the point. When you copy your spelling words, you're not just trying to get them right. You're trying to keep them neat enough to avoid inspection. When you read aloud, you're not just sounding out the words. You're willing your voice to stay steady so you don't stumble. Every creak of a desk, every cough, every shuffle of feet feels like it might draw unwanted attention. You learn to move quietly, speak sparingly, and read the room as carefully as you read the Bible passages. Yet here's the irony. Despite the sternness, many teachers saw themselves as improving you through discipline. The world outside the schoolhouse was harsh. Factories, fields, and service work demanded obedience, punctuality, and endurance. A school that trained you to keep your back straight and your voice low was, in their view, preparing you for real life. For the poor, this could be the difference between keeping a job and losing it. For the wealthy, it reinforced the idea that order and self-control were marks of refinement. You glance around the room. On the boys' side, one lad's head is drooping, caught in that dangerous space between listening and sleep. The teacher's voice stops mid-sentence. Silence stretches. Then, in a voice that could strip paint, the teacher calls his name. The boy startles, stands, and is told to recite the last 3 lines read aloud. He stumbles through them. A punishment is handed out, a set of lines to be completed before the day's end. You sit straighter. You are wide awake now. It's easy from a modern armchair to scoff at all this. Surely you think children learned better when they felt safe and encouraged. But the Victorian classroom wasn't built for comfort. It was built for conformity. Education was a privilege, and privileges came with expectations. If that meant fear was part of the lesson, so be it. By the time the afternoon lessons end, you've survived without being singled out. You haven't spoken out of turn. Your posture has been impeccable. Your work is tidy enough to pass inspection. And still, when you walk home, you feel as though you've been holding your breath all day, because tomorrow the rules will be the same, and the punishments, if you cross them, will be waiting. If you've made it this far without subscribing, you're braver than most. Or you're just hoping I won't notice. I do notice. Hit subscribe before I hand you the dunce cap. You think you know what a teacher looks like. A friendly smile, perhaps. An encouraging nod when you finally get your sums right. Someone who listens when you explain why your homework is late. Forget all that. This is the Victorian classroom. The teacher's authority is not suggested. It is absolute. In the early decades, most teachers are men. They stand at the front like commanders on a battlefield, surveying the ranks of small, restless soldiers in pinafores and short trousers. Their coats are buttoned to the chin, their collars stiff enough to cut paper, and their expression rarely wavers from stern to slightly less stern. For the most part, they are drawn from the ranks of those who could afford a better education themselves. Some are ex-clergy, some retired military men, others trained in the emerging normal schools for teachers. All share the same understanding. The classroom is not a place for negotiation. If you question them, you're not expressing yourself. You're undermining the very fabric of civilization, or at least their afternoon timetable. Women begin to enter the profession later, as the demand for teachers grows, and the idea takes hold that women might be particularly suited to managing younger children. Their pay is lower, their authority often challenged, but they bring with them a certain patience that some pupils, though not all, find preferable. A female teacher might correct your work without the sting of a cane, but she'll still expect you to stand when she enters the room, speak only when spoken to, and address her as Miss with crisp clarity. Then there's the pupil-teacher system, a peculiarly Victorian invention. Imagine you're 14 and, instead of escaping school to find work, you're promoted to teach the younger children. You've got one foot in the world of the pupils, the other in the world of the staff, and neither side fully accepts you. As a pupil teacher, you arrive earlier, leave later, and spend your days guiding children only a few years younger than yourself through the alphabet and multiplication tables. You're paid a small stipend, expected to keep up your own studies, and treated as both apprentice and authority figure. To the younger ones, you're a combination of older sibling and minor tyrant. To the older teachers, you're useful but not quite trustworthy, someone who still needs supervision. Authority is not up for debate. In this room, the teacher's word is law. They decide who speaks, who sits where, who earns praise, and who is humiliated in front of everyone. They are judge, jury, and, occasionally, executioner of your afternoon's peace. It's not unusual for teachers to pace between the rows of desks, hands clasped behind their back, eyes flicking from slate to slate. They can spot a wrong sum from 3 steps away. They can sense when a pen nib is about to blot. They can tell, without looking, when someone is whispering. The best teachers, by Victorian standards, can keep a room of 50 or more children silent without raising their voice. A single look will do it. You've seen it happen. The boy next to you starts tapping his slate with the end of his chalk, and before he can make a second tap, the teacher's gaze has found him. He stops. The room breathes out. The worst teachers, well, let's just say they lean on the cane more than the curriculum. Training is still an evolving concept in these years. Some teachers are formally educated in pedagogy. Others are simply people who know enough to stay one chapter ahead of their pupils in the textbook. The quality of your education can swing wildly depending on which kind you get. One might inspire you to take pride in your work, even if it's just perfecting your copper plate. Another might convince you that learning is a punishment in itself. From your seat in the middle row, the teacher seems almost part of the furniture, as fixed as the blackboard, as constant as the smell of chalk. But every so often, you catch a glimpse of the person behind the roll. A cough muffled into a handkerchief. A quiet word to a pupil who's clearly come to school without breakfast. A moment of laughter, rare and short-lived, but enough to make you remember they are human after all. Still, they keep a careful distance. Familiarity is not encouraged. A teacher who gets too close to their pupils risks losing that aura of command. And without that, in a room of 50 restless children, chaos is only minutes away. The Victorian teacher's greatest skill isn't just knowing the lessons. It's maintaining order long enough to deliver them. That means balancing strictness with just enough fairness to be respected. Too much of one, and they're feared. Too much of the other, and they're ignored. By the end of the day, you leave the classroom with the teacher's voice still echoing in your head. The lessons, the corrections, the occasional sharp command, all blending into the rhythm of your education. And tomorrow, they'll be there again, standing at the front, coat buttoned, chalk in hand, ready to do it all over. You probably didn't walk into the Victorian schoolroom thinking it was your ticket out of poverty. Most children didn't. School for many was less about changing your life and more about learning enough to keep your job. But, and here's where the Victorians occasionally surprised themselves, there were rare, shining moments when education cracked open a door that had previously been nailed shut. For the working class child, the most direct ladder up came through the pupil-teacher system. Picture it. You've survived years of spelling drills, mental arithmetic, and stern glares without being expelled, broken, or permanently assigned to the corner. You're 14, clever, and, most importantly, punctual. The headmaster offers you the chance to stay on as a pupil teacher. The pay isn't much, but in a world where many of your friends are already hauling coal or sewing seams for 14 hours a day, a steady wage and a chance to keep learning is no small thing. You arrive earlier than the pupils, leave later than them, and spend your days teaching the alphabet to squirming 6-year-olds or explaining fractions to boys who'd rather be anywhere else. You're still a teenager, but now you're saving pennies, building skills, and maybe, just maybe, setting your sights beyond the factory gates. For some, this path worked. A pupil teacher could, with enough dedication, move into a full teaching role. From there, a steady income and respectability opened the door to the lower rungs of the middle class. You might rent a slightly better house, own a slightly sturdier coat, and be treated just a little differently at church. It was rare, but it was real. Girls, too, could seize these opportunities, though the rungs of their ladder were shorter. A girl might become a teacher, a governess in a wealthier household, or even a schoolmistress running her own small dame school. Compared to the laundry or the factory, these jobs were cleaner, safer, and came with an air of professionalism. But the ceiling was low, the pay was lower than men's, and marriage often meant the end of a teaching career. Still, for a young woman from a poor family, the classroom could be the one place where her mind, rather than just her hands, earned her bread. Outside teaching, education could open other doors. Clerical work, shop assistants in more respectable establishments, apprenticeships in skilled trades. These jobs were often closed to the completely uneducated. Reading, writing, and basic arithmetic could make the difference between working behind the counter or sweeping the shop floor. The effect was subtle but significant. A literate child had more chances, however small, to step into roles with a future. Of course, this is still Victorian Britain, where the class system is about as flexible as a church pew. For every story of a boy rising from a ragged school to become a respected schoolmaster, there were thousands whose education ended at 12 and whose lives stayed much the same as their parents'. And let's be honest, upward mobility usually required more than hard work. A patron, a timely recommendation, a stroke of luck. These were often just as important as good marks in your copybook. But the idea of mobility mattered. It gave parents a reason to scrape together pennies for school fees before 1891, when education finally became free. It made some families decide to send their children to class instead of into the nearest workshop, at least for a few years. It also gave pupils something to aim for. Even if the odds were long, the dream of a better job, a better house, A better suit of Sunday clothes kept some going through the endless drills and the constant fear of the cane. You imagine yourself at the end of the term, wages from your pupil teacher work folded neatly in your pocket. You've bought a second-hand book for yourself, not for class, not for homework, but because you want to read it. It's not much, but it's more than most people in your street will ever have. And it started with those endless mornings at the desk, scratching letters into a slate, while a teacher in a starched collar looked on. Victorian schools weren't built to revolutionize the class system, but they did, on occasion, create cracks in it, narrow openings where a determined boy or girl could squeeze through. And for those who made it, that was enough to change not just their life, but the lives of their children. You've made it through the schoolroom doors. Your slate is on the desk. Your boots are damp but still holding together. You're here, and that's more than some can say. Because in Victorian Britain, the classroom wasn't just a place of learning. It was also a dividing line. Plenty of children never crossed it. Some were down the mines before they were tall enough to see over the breakfast table. You picture it. A boy your age, lamp strapped to his head, crawling through a tunnel barely wider than his shoulders. He's learning, yes, but it's the kind of education that teaches you how to swing a pick in the dark and tell the time by the rumble of carts above your head. Others worked in textile mills. Their lessons were the rhythm of the looms, the hiss of steam, and the knowledge that a moment's distraction could cost you a finger. Then there were the street sellers, barefoot, quick-tongued, offering matches, flowers, or penny papers to passers-by. Their education came in the form of knowing which corners brought the best trade and how to dodge the attention of the constable. In the countryside, the absence from school was just as stark. On small farms, children weren't too young to work. They were just small enough to squeeze through hedges after runaway hens, light enough to lead a horse without straining, and nimble enough to pick stones from between the rows. Harvest time especially pulled them from lessons, if they'd been attending at all. The fields couldn't wait for exams, and when the winter brought frost to the ground, many still had to break the ice on the water trough before the first light touched the barn roof. Some children were kept away, not by labor, but by life itself. Illness was a stubborn enemy in the 19th century. A lingering cough could sideline you for months. An untreated infection could take you from your desk to a bed you might never leave. Disability often meant exclusion entirely. A child who couldn't see the board, hear the lessons, or sit still without pain was frequently deemed unfit for schooling. There were few, if any, provisions made to adapt lessons, and so they stayed at home, or in some cases, were sent to institutions where the focus was on care rather than learning. The law didn't fix this overnight. Even after the 1870 Education Act made schooling compulsory for children aged 5 to 10, attendance was spotty. Enforcement was tricky in crowded cities and even harder in rural villages. And while education was declared free in 1891, the reality was that uniforms, boots, and books still cost money. For a family living hand to mouth, a child's wage, however small, could mean the difference between bread and no bread. Sending them to school was a gamble, and not one every family could take. You imagine yourself standing in the street, books under your arm, watching other children your age hurry past in the opposite direction. They're not late for class. They're late for work. One is pushing a barrow of coal, the other carrying a tray of muffins to sell door to door. You feel a pang. Not pity exactly. Their lives are hard. but they're not helpless. It's more a realization. You're learning your letters while they're learning how to keep a family afloat. Opportunity was never equal. The Victorian classroom was often painted as a grand step toward fairness, a place where anyone could rise if they worked hard enough. But the truth was more uneven. Some never got a seat at the desk, not because they didn't want one, but because life had other plans, harsher, louder, and more immediate than any lesson. For every child bent over a slate in the dim light of a schoolroom, there were others bent over a workbench, a coal cart, or a washtub. It's tempting, from a comfortable distance, to see this as a failing of the era, and it was, in part. But it was also the inevitable reality of a society in which survival came before self-improvement. The school bell might have rung for everyone in theory. In practice, its sound carried only so far, and for many, it never reached them at all. And tomorrow, when you walk back into class and scrape your chalk across the slate, you'll remember. You're not here just because you earned it. You're here because you could be. And that simple fact, the difference between being taught and being left outside, shapes more than just your handwriting. For most Victorian children, the best part of the school day was not the moment they learned to form a perfect copperplate A or solve an arithmetic problem without counting on their fingers. No. The real prize came when the teacher finally shut the lesson book, looked at the clock, and declared, "Playtime." The yard was no playground in the modern sense. No bright slides, no painted markings for hopscotch, no rubber mats for safety. It was often just a patch of beaten earth or cobbles surrounded by high walls, the kind that kept you in just as much as they kept strangers out. Still, to a child who'd been sitting bolt upright at a desk for hours, this bare, echoing rectangle was freedom itself. The simplest amusements required nothing but your body and the willingness to ignore the mud. Hoop rolling was a favorite. You grabbed a wooden or metal hoop, set it upright, and chased it along with a stick, trying to keep it from toppling over. It sounds easy until you try it on uneven cobbles with the wind cutting across the yard, or until a bigger child deliberately, accidentally bumps into you, so their hoop overtakes yours. Then there were marbles, a game that could turn peaceful classmates into cutthroat competitors in under a minute. The clink of glass against glass was the soundtrack of many a break, the winners leaving with bulging pockets, while the losers nursed both bruised knees and pride. Hopscotch existed too, scratched out in chalk or etched into dirt with the heel of a boot. The rules were simple: hop, land, and keep your balance. The real challenge was doing it in skirts or with stiff boots that made bending your toes a small act of rebellion. And, of course, there was pig's bladder football, exactly what it sounds like. A real pig's bladder, inflated and knotted, became the ball. It was slippery, lopsided, and prone to bursting at the worst possible moment. But no one seemed to mind, as one might say, because nothing builds character like chasing a pig's bladder through the mud. The schoolyard was not a democracy, far from it. Games had unspoken hierarchies, and you learned them quickly. The oldest, tallest boys often claimed the best spots for football or hoop rolling, while smaller children were left to the edges, where games of marbles or skipping ropes could carry on in relative peace. If you were fast, you could earn a spot among the favored players. Speed was a currency even bullies respected. But if you tripped often, ran slowly, or just had a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, you'd soon find yourself in the outer circle of the playground society. Girls navigated a different set of rules. Skipping games, clapping rhymes, and hopscotch formed their main territories, but crossing into the football zone could invite either grudging respect or open mockery, depending on the mood of the boys. There was no indoor recess in the Victorian era. Rain meant the yard turned into a shallow lake. Snow meant frozen fingers and toes. If you were lucky, you'd been sent to school in a coat thick enough to block some of the wind. If not, you played harder, moving constantly to keep warm. The cold was an opponent in its own right, and beating it required both determination and a willingness to return to the classroom covered in mud, which would then earn you the glare of a teacher who had no sympathy for your frozen state. Many children brought their own small amusements: a length of string for cat's cradle, a whittled stick, or, for the truly daring, a spinning top that could be sent skittering across the yard until it collided with someone's ankle. Anything could become a toy if you had imagination and a few minutes before the bell rang again. A stray stone could be the centerpiece of a throwing game. A bit of chalk could transform a wall into an impromptu drawing board. And a dropped button could be the start of a new round of marbles for those who didn't own any. For all the laughter and energy, break time was also a lesson in diplomacy and survival. You learned who you could trust to pass the ball back, who would take it and run until the bell, and who had a knack for turning any disagreement into a full-blown quarrel. You learned to negotiate game rules, to accept defeat when you were outnumbered, and to fight tooth and nail for your place when you weren't. And you learned the golden rule. When the teacher stepped outside, everyone became miraculously well-behaved. Just as your cheeks are flushed, your hands dirty, and your heart pounding with the thrill of the chase, the bell rings. The groans are universal. Hoops roll to a stop, marbles are scooped into pockets, and the pig's bladder is left deflated in a corner for the next round. You file back inside, boots scraping the floor, the smell of fresh air clinging to your clothes, a brief, stubborn reminder that for 20 minutes you weren't a pupil under the eye of authority. You were just a child running through the mud, playing games that had been played for centuries before you and would be played for decades after. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Because however stiff the lessons, however long the hours, there's always that moment in the middle of the day when the door opens, the yard calls, and you remember what it feels like to be free, even if it's only for the length of a pig's bladder's lifespan. The desks are empty now. The last shuffle of boots has faded down the corridor, and the great wooden door has thudded shut for the day. You sit alone for a moment longer, breathing in the smell of chalk, ink, and worn timber. Your slate is clean, not a single smudge left from the day's careful copywork. The inkwells sit still, their lids closed, the black liquid inside cooling and congealing. Outside, the late Victorian afternoon is already dimming. Lamplight spills in yellow pools onto the cobbles, blurring in the mist that rolls between the brick buildings. Tomorrow, you'll be back here again. Knees pressed together, back straight, eyes fixed on the board. You'll stand for prayers, copy your spelling lists, and try to keep your letters sharp even when your hand aches. You'll watch the clock, waiting for the small mercy of playtime, then file back in, slightly muddier, but no less watchful for the teacher's eye. But that's tomorrow. For now, you can close your eyes. No lessons, no cane, no sharp voice calling your name across the room. Just the muffled clatter of a cart rolling past outside, the faint hiss of a gas lamp, and the low, restless hum of the city settling into night. In the quiet, you realize that Victorian school days were never just about reading and writing. They were about learning the rules, not only the ones in the copybooks, but the unspoken ones that shaped who you could be. They were about discipline, duty, and the occasional burst of joy when the yard was yours for 20 minutes. And if you dream tonight, make sure it's neat. The Victorians had very strong opinions about sloppy imagination. Sleep well, Victorian you. The bell will ring again soon enough. And if you've made it this far without clicking subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments. I read them all.